You think you can spot propaganda. Most people do. They picture it as something obvious. Posters with raised fists, speeches at rallies, state television telling you what to think. And yes, that exists. That's real. But here's the problem. The propaganda you can see isn't the propaganda that works. The techniques that actually shape how you think, what you fear, who you trust, those don't announce themselves. They don't look like manipulation. They look like news, like common sense, like things you figured out yourself. This is the Iceberg Project, and today we're going under the surface of propaganda, from the techniques everyone recognizes down to the ones that are already working on you right now. Let's start at the top. Level 1. The propaganda you already know. The first level of the iceberg is the propaganda nobody falls for anymore, or so we think. World War II, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union. These are the examples that come to mind when most people hear the word propaganda, and for good reason. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, understood something that most governments before him didn't fully grasp. You don't need to convince people with arguments. You need to overwhelm them with repetition, control the radio, control the press, control the image, repeat the message until it stops feeling like a message and starts feeling like reality. In the Soviet Union, the mechanism was different, but the principle was identical. Posters, parades, rewritten textbooks, an entire population surrounded by a version of the world the state had constructed. In wartime America, propaganda moved in the opposite political direction, but used identical tools: government-produced films, recruitment posters, a media apparatus actively shaping public emotion towards specific ends. We look back at these examples and feel comfortable, distant. We tell ourselves we would have seen through it, but that comfort is exactly what the next levels of this iceberg are built on. Case: the Bryce Report, 1915. Here's a specific example that shows how Level 1 propaganda worked and what made it complicated even then. When World War I began, Britain needed to justify entering the conflict to its own population, and especially to neutral America. The government commissioned an official inquiry into alleged German atrocities in Belgium, led by respected historian and diplomat Lord Bryce. The resulting document became known as the Bryce Report. It described systematic violence against Belgian civilians during the German invasion, killings, destruction of towns, abuse of non-combatants. The report was translated into over 30 languages and distributed widely across the United States. Recruitment numbers in Britain spiked. American public opinion shifted sharply against Germany. Here's where it gets complicated. Modern historians reviewing the evidence decades later have concluded that the core findings of the Bryce Report were substantially accurate. German forces did commit serious atrocities in Belgium in 1914. The underlying events were real, but the report also included sensationalist witness accounts, stories of extreme acts that were exaggerated or could not be verified, and these were presented alongside documented evidence without clear distinction. The most lurid claims spread fastest. They were repeated, amplified, and used to generate maximum outrage. The real suffering of Belgian civilians became inseparable from embellishments designed to produce a specific emotional response. That's Level 1. It doesn't require pure fabrication. It requires taking something real and framing it for maximum effect, selecting what to amplify and what to leave out, and it worked, just as intended. Level 2, the half-truth. Now we go deeper, because if Level 1 uses real events with exaggerated framing, Level 2 is something more precise and more dangerous. Level 2 is the truth, just not the whole truth. Half-truths are harder to fight than lies. If someone tells you something that is technically accurate, you have no obvious reason to push back. The fact checks out. The statistic exists, the event happened. What's missing is context, and context is everything. This technique has a name in media theory: cherry picking. You select only the information that supports your conclusion and present it as the full picture. Everything you say is true, the impression you create is false. Governments, media organizations, and political movements across the entire ideological spectrum use this constantly. It doesn't require lying, it only requires selective honesty. Case: the Gulf of Tonkin, 1964. On August 2, 1964, a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Maddox, was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. That happened. It was real. 2 days later, the Johnson administration reported a second attack on U.S. ships in the same waters. Based on this second incident, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the president broad authority to escalate military operations in Vietnam. It became the legal foundation for full American involvement in the war. The problem: the second attack almost certainly never happened. NSA documents declassified in 2005, including an internal study by NSA historian Robert Hanyok, concluded that signals intelligence had been misread and, more significantly, that intelligence was presented to decision-makers in a way that excluded contradictory evidence. The NSA's own historian found that analysts had made the intelligence fit the conclusion, not the other way around. Ship commanders on the scene later acknowledged that no reliable proof existed of enemy vessels that night. In the 2003 documentary The Fog of War, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara acknowledged there had been no attack on August 4th. But here's what makes this a perfect Level 2 case rather than simple deception. The administration didn't invent the incident from nothing. They took a real event, the confirmed first attack, and used it to make an unverified second event credible. One truth was used to sell a likely fiction. The result: the legal basis for a war that lasted over a decade. That's the mechanism of the half-truth, not invention, leverage. Level 3. You don't decide what to think, you decide what to think about. We're now below the waterline. Levels 1 and 2 are about the content of information, exaggeration, selective truth, false framing. Level 3 is different. It's not about what you're told, it's about what you're shown at all. There's a concept in media theory called agenda setting. The idea is simple but profound. Media doesn't tell you what to think, it tells you what to think about. When a story dominates every channel, every newspaper, every social media feed, it feels important, urgent, central to reality. Meanwhile, dozens of other stories are happening simultaneously that you will never hear about. Not because they're less significant, but because no one pointed a camera at them. This is the architecture of public attention, and whoever controls that architecture controls what feels real. There's a related concept called the Overton window. It describes the range of ideas considered acceptable to discuss in public at any given moment. Certain positions are mainstream, others are fringe, others are unspeakable. The window can be moved, slowly, over years. An idea that was considered radical a decade ago becomes debatable, then reasonable, then obvious. Nobody announces the shift. It just happens. Through repetition, through framing, through what gets covered and what gets ignored. You don't notice the window moving. You just notice that your opinions feel like common sense. Case: the War on Drugs, 1971. In 1994, journalist Dan Baum interviewed John Ehrlichman, one of President Nixon's top domestic policy advisors, who had later served prison time for his role in the Watergate scandal. According to Baum, who published the account in Harper's Magazine in 2016, Ehrlichman said this, that the Nixon administration had two political enemies, the anti-war left and Black Americans, and that by associating those groups with specific drugs and then criminalizing those drugs heavily, they could disrupt both communities, arrest their leaders, and raid their homes. It's worth noting, Ehrlichman's family disputes the accuracy of this account, and some historians argue it oversimplifies Nixon's motivations. The quote was published 22 years after the interview, when Ehrlichman was no longer alive to confirm or deny it. But here's what is documented, regardless of Ehrlichman's intent. The war on drugs was announced publicly as a public health emergency, a moral crisis. Media coverage for decades focused almost entirely on drugs themselves. The crime, the addiction, the social decay. What received far less coverage, the documented racial disparities built into the policy. Crack cocaine, more prevalent in black communities, carried federal sentences up to 100 times harsher than powder cocaine for equivalent amounts. That disparity existed in U.S. law for decades and was only partially addressed by Congress in 2010. Whether the targeting was deliberate policy or structural consequence, the agenda was set. Drugs were the story, the disparity was not. The most effective form of agenda control isn't removing information, it's ensuring that certain questions are never central to the conversation. Level 4. The word is the weapon. Deeper still. By now we've covered exaggerated framing, selective truth, and the control of attention. But there's a layer underneath all of that, one that operates before you even begin to evaluate information, language itself. The words used to describe an event don't just label it, they frame it. They determine which emotions it triggers, which comparisons it invites, which conclusions feel natural. This isn't a conspiracy, it's linguistics, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A person killed in an airstrike can be described as a casualty, collateral damage, or a dead child. All three can refer to the same event. Each produces a completely different psychological response. A government can eliminate a political opponent, neutralize a threat, or murder a critic. Same action, entirely different reality. George Orwell wrote about this in 1946 in an essay called Politics in the English Language. His argument was that vague, abstract language is not accidental. It exists to create distance between the word and the thing it describes, to make uncomfortable realities harder to visualize. A few years later, he built an entire fictional language around this idea. In 1984, the totalitarian state uses newspeak, a deliberately shrinking vocabulary designed to make certain thoughts literally impossible to form. If the word doesn't exist, the concept becomes unreachable. That was fiction. The principle is not. Case: enhanced interrogation, post 9/11. After the September 11th attacks, the United States government authorized a set of interrogation techniques for use on detainees in the War on Terror. These techniques included sleep deprivation for extended periods, stress positions, confinement in small boxes, and waterboarding, a method that produces the physical sensation of drowning. The official term used by the government and adopted widely in media coverage was enhanced interrogation, not torture, enhanced interrogation. This distinction carried legal weight. The United States had signed the UN Convention Against Torture, which prohibited torture explicitly. By defining these techniques as something other than torture, the administration created legal space for practices that human rights organizations, foreign governments, and a number of legal scholars described using a different word entirely. The Senate Intelligence Committee's report, released in 2014, concluded that these techniques produce little to no reliable intelligence, and that the CIA had misrepresented their effectiveness to oversight bodies. The public debate for years centered on whether the techniques were effective. The framing, the word itself, had already done its work. Enhanced interrogation sounds clinical, technical, bureaucratic. It doesn't sound like what the Senate's own report described. That gap between the word and the reality, that's level 4. Language deployed not to describe the world, but to manage how you feel about it. Level 5. The propaganda. You defend. We're at the bottom of the iceberg now. Everything above this level required someone to push a message. A government, a media organization, a political movement. Someone made a decision to shape perception. Level 5 is different. At level 5, the propaganda doesn't need to be pushed anymore. People carry it themselves, defend it, pass it on voluntarily, and attack anyone who questions it. This is the deepest and most durable form of manipulation ever identified, not because it's the most sophisticated technically, but because it makes the target into a participant. Here's the mechanism. Human beings are not primarily rational creatures who occasionally feel emotions. We are social creatures who use reasoning to defend conclusions we've already reached emotionally. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning. We don't evaluate information neutrally. We evaluate it through the filter of who we are, or more precisely, who we believe ourselves to be. When a belief becomes part of your identity, challenging that belief stops feeling like an intellectual disagreement. It feels like an attack on you personally. This is what Level 5 propaganda targets, not your mind, your identity. Once a narrative is successfully fused with who someone is, their nationality, their religion, their political tribe, their sense of themselves as a good person, that narrative becomes nearly impossible to dislodge through facts alone, because facts aren't the point anymore. The point is belonging, and belonging to the human brain feels like survival. Case: North Korea and the cult of personality. North Korea is the most extensively documented example of Level 5 propaganda operating at a national scale over multiple generations. For 3 generations, the Kim family has been presented not merely as political leaders but as figures of near mythological significance. The founding mythology of Kim Il-sung describes his birth as accompanied by extraordinary natural phenomena. Children are taught these narratives before they develop the capacity for critical evaluation. The emotional architecture, gratitude, devotion, reverence, is constructed early and systematically. What makes North Korea a Level 5 case rather than simply an extreme Level 1 case is what defectors consistently report. Many of them genuinely believed, not because information was unavailable in any abstract sense, but because the belief had become fused with everything they were. To question the Kim family was not to question a political system. It was to question your parents, your teachers, your childhood, your entire framework for understanding reality. It meant accepting that everything you loved and trusted had been constructed around a lie. Defector Hyunseo Lee, in her memoir and public testimony, described the experience of her belief beginning to crack, not as a moment of clarity, but as a kind of internal collapse. The belief didn't simply yield to evidence, it fought back, because it had become her. North Korea is an extreme case. The mechanism is not. It operates wherever identity and belief become inseparable, wherever questioning an idea means losing your community, wherever the cost of changing your mind is higher than the cost of remaining wrong. Look around. We started at the surface. Posters, rallies, state broadcasts. The propaganda that's easy to see, easy to condemn, and easy to believe you'd never fall for. Then we went deeper, real events reframed for maximum effect. Facts that are technically accurate and functionally misleading. Agendas shaped not through lies, but through the careful selection of what receives attention. Language engineered to create distance between words and the realities they describe. And finally, belief systems fused with identity, defended not because they're true, but because abandoning them feels like self-destruction. Here's the uncomfortable conclusion. The further down the iceberg you go, the less propaganda looks like propaganda. It looks like news, like culture, like common sense, like something you worked out yourself. The techniques that don't work on you are the ones you can name. The ones that do work, you probably can't see them yet. Not because you're not intelligent, but because that's precisely how they're designed. Awareness is not immunity, but it's the only place to start. This has been the Iceberg Project. If this format is useful to you, we'll keep going. Subscribe to stay connected.